Well, 96% of Australian families will pay less in childcare from July next year under new reforms introduced by the government. But is making it cheaper getting to the bottom of the core issue in the sector? Both the Greens and Coalition have raised concerns over the $5 billion package, fearing it doesn't address the key crisis of workforce shortages in early education. Joining me now live is the Shadow Minister for Early Childhood Education, Angie. Thanks for joining us this morning. Labor says this legislation ensures no family is worse off. Do you agree?
Well, good morning, Danica. Thanks for having me on the show this morning. Look, we've had a look at this legislation, came into the House on Tuesday, and we have some very real concerns around, as you mentioned, the workforce issues and the lack of plan for workforce now, which is in crisis. We also have major concerns in terms of access for families across regional Australia. 30% or more than 30% of families currently in Australia live in a childcare desert, and 50% of those are in regional and remote Australia. The other 50% are actually in outer metro areas, and there's nothing in this bill that will address the childcare deserts and thin markets, as they're known, across the country for families. So we're not convinced that it will provide one extra place. It's a $4.5 billion package, revised down from 5.4, and we're not convinced that it's going to deliver one extra place for Australian families.
OK, you mentioned workforce shortages. Why is there such a staff shortage? What's causing this?
Well, it's a number of factors, Danica. Obviously, COVID was a factor, but workers across the sector also feel they're not being valued, they're being underpaid. That's what they're telling me in the roundtables that I've conducted around the country in the last more than 100 days. They are their concerns, but certainly there are 7,000 job vacancies currently across the sector, and also, Good Start Early Learning have projected that they will require another 10,000 ECEs and ECTs, that's early childhood educators and early childhood teachers, across the sector in order to fill the demand that is going to be driven by this new legislation.
So, in your view then, how can you attract more people to the sector?
Well, this is a job for the government in terms of what their plan is for workforce issues right now. The sector is under great pressure. The workers are tired, they're stressed, and we're seeing centres cap their enrolments because they're not able to meet their ratios already. And so we have very deep concerns about the supply and demand area in this legislation in terms of the pressure that it will put across the sector.
You've been out there speaking, though, to early childhood educators, though. What are they telling you about how we can introduce more people into this sector or attract more people into the sector?
Well, the sector have, at their roundtables, put a few ideas on the table. One of them is a retention bonus for workers. The other one is that the government has agreed to pay for increases for aged care workers, and those workers in the early childhood education sector are concerned that they're being left behind by this Labor government.
The ACCC has been tasked with looking into the cost of childcare. Is the problem that prices are too high?
Well, the problem is that this legislation won't kick in until next July, and the ACCC inquiry is not due to come back until the end of next year. And so families won't see the benefit of this legislation until down the road. Now, Labor could have brought this legislation forward, but they chose not to. They've kicked it down the road. They're using software upgrades as an excuse for not bringing it forward, for not delivering their promise to Australian families across the country. And so this is a typical case of not enough detail and not enough work. They haven't done the modelling required on workforce participation in terms of women's workforce participation, which under the Coalition was at its highest at 62.3%. Under Labor, last time it was 58%. So I think the Coalition's record stands that we've done a good job in the early childhood education sector in terms of delivering extra places for Australian families. We delivered an additional 280,000 children into childcare under our reforms, the biggest reform package in 40 years, Danica. And so we're yet to see whether some of these increases will be lost. The childcare subsidy increases may be lost up to perhaps half to inflationary pressures. And so I think, we have some very big concerns around this legislation. Of course, we want to see access for regional and remote Australians. Of course, we want to see further access for the most disadvantaged families and indeed Indigenous families as well across the country. And we don't see that in this legislation.
But is there a problem with costing, though? Are childcare centres price gouging?
Well, childcare centres are considering increasing their fees across the nation. There are centres and groups that are considering that in anticipation of this legislation. And so there is a real risk that the increase, the $4.5 billion, some, perhaps half, could be lost to childcare increases in fees. And so we're yet to see how effective this bill will actually be. So we do have some real concerns around that as a coalition. We're looking at it in party room and we'll come to our position in due course.
Angie Bell, we do have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us.